Right now on Upfront.
Warning signs.
The country's going to hell, and we're not going to let it happen.
The new indicators from Tuesday's presidential primary. President Biden returning to Wisconsin tomorrow.
I'm excited about voting for Joe Biden.
Former President Donald Trump in his first Wisconsin stop of the cycle.
What did you think?
Amazing. Amazing.
Now all eyes on Wisconsin. Inside the Trump rally, the push by the party to vote early and the pushback from Trump. Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley then on Democrats protesting Biden. Then the Lincoln Project.
Wisconsin really is the tipping point state. It is the state that will decide.
The group's presence right now in Wisconsin. Their goal ahead of 2024. Are they expanding beyond anti-Trump? Staying in office.
We have to reintroduce ourselves and restore trust with the people of the city of Milwaukee.
Democratic State Rep Evan Goyke elected Milwaukee's new city attorney, but he's not leaving the legislature just yet. The politics behind it just moments away.
This is Upfront with Jaron Jordan and political director Matt Smith.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. President Biden returning to Wisconsin tomorrow, his third visit to the state this year alone, as new warning signs emerged this weekend for both campaigns. Former President Donald Trump was in Green Bay Tuesday. More on that in a minute. Trump won Tuesday's presidential Republican primary, but more than 120,000 Republican voters voted for someone else. 13% for Nikki Haley statewide. President Biden won the Democratic primary, but more than 48,000 Democrats voted uninstructed, a protest to Biden's support of Israel. We'll start there and get to it all with Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley, who's here just fresh off his own re-election win on Tuesday. County Executive, welcome back to the show. Good to see you.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
We'll talk about the county first. Let's first talk about President Biden coming again to Madison tomorrow. I want to start with that uninstructed vote, more than 48,000 Democrats. Is that a big concern for Democrats?
Well, I think as we move into the November election, it's not too much of a huge concern for me. One, as you pointed out, there was more of a reform related to President Trump's and what he's bringing to the table. But I think as we get closer to November, I think Democrats all across the country and in Wisconsin will understand that President Joe Biden is the person to do the job. And when we're thinking about the issues that are facing Gaza and within Israel, at the end of the day, we know that Joe Biden is going to be the guy who's going to lead us to where we need to go. And so at the end of the day, for me, it's about how do we continue to tell the good story, not only here within Milwaukee, but across the state and across the country, what Democrats have done for our nation.
Is it going to take some convincing in counties like Milwaukee and Dane?
I think it's about just having the conversation. We've been talking about the presidential election before I even had a chance to even vote for myself with the spring election that we just had. And so I think that as we get closer, understanding we now have the two nominees on both sides of the aisle with Donald Trump and President Joe Biden, people are going to start paying attention even more.
President Biden in Madison tomorrow. He was in Milwaukee recently. You had some time with him on the tarmac with the mayor and Congresswoman Gwen Moore. We saw those interactions. What happened in those conversations?
Well, one, just really saying thank you for a lot of the investments that he's brought back right here to Milwaukee County. One, I wanted to say thank you again because we're building 100 brand new single-family homes in the King Park neighborhood. If it wasn't for the investment of the American Rescue Plan Act, we wouldn't have been able to do that. And so it was a great opportunity to tell President Biden, thank you for all of his work, but to let him also know that I'm in his corner and that anything that he needs to get over the finish line in November, he can call on me.
What did he say to you?
Well, he's going to continue to call on me. And he absolutely believes in the work that we're doing within Milwaukee County and loves the fact that we're investing in affordable housing in our own backyard.
You're a young Democratic leader in the county who won by an incredibly overwhelming margin. I'm curious, how concerned are you about the president's age going into November?
I'm not concerned about his age because at the end of the day, his ideas aren't as old as him. His ideas are actually talking about the future of what America should be. And when he talks about his ideas and what the future should be, I think about my three young girls. But at the end of the day, it's a stark contrast when you think about Donald Trump. He's bringing back old ideas and literally wants to turn back the clock and the calendar to the days where, women didn't have reproductive freedoms. And so for me, again, we just have to tell that good story is what we've been doing, particularly within local municipalities, because we have a great story to tell and can contribute that to President Biden.
Let's talk about the county and the next 4 years. What do you see as the biggest challenge ahead in the county?
Well, first and foremost, I think I should say thank you to all the voters who actually voted for me and believed in me. But I would say that even though we have been able to put Milwaukee County on a much better fiscal sustainability path, we know that we're looking at more deficits in the future. future. And so for me, it's about how do we continue to partner and collaborate with our state and federal partners to bring back more resources.
What is the county's role when we look ahead to the Republican National Convention here in the city of Milwaukee, and what is your role as we get closer to that?
Well, I think everybody understands that my politics are quite clear. I am definitely a Democrat, and I definitely am in opposition of the nominee for the Republican Party. But as the county executive, it is my job to showcase what we have right here within Milwaukee County. And this is the biggest party that the Republican National Convention has every 4 years. And it's our job to make sure that it goes on without a hitch, and making sure that we keep those delegates safe, as well as the people that live here and play here safe. And so this is a great opportunity for us, and it is just my job to make sure that I play an extension of Visit Milwaukee and make sure that we continue to promote all the great things we have.
Fresh off his win, Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley, County Executive, thank you like always.
Thank you for having me.
Former President Trump made his first campaign stop in Wisconsin this cycle, the night of Wisconsin's primary in Northeast Wisconsin, as the party looks to push Trump supporters to vote early.
You're okay, go ahead.
On a rainy and snowy Green Bay day, supporters lined up outside for hours to be some of the first to see former President Donald Trump in his first Wisconsin rally of the 2024 cycle.
What did you think?
Amazing, amazing.
Look, we won in 2016. We did much better in 2028 to say we did a hell of a lot better.
The party and Trump supporters are at a bit of a crossroads.
At this point, looking ahead to November, are you 100% all in on Trump?
Oh, absolutely. He's got to win.
Trump continuing to falsely claim he would have won states like Wisconsin in 2020 if not for fraud and absentee voting in cities like Milwaukee.
You know, we won this state. We won this state by a lot. And it came out that we won this state, actually.
The rally even featuring an appearance by Mike Lindell. A standing ovation for the MyPillow CEO, who's peddled conspiracy theories and faced a multi-million-dollar federal judgment over his false claims targeting the 2020 election.
We all know what happened in Wisconsin in the 2020 election.
All this as state Republican Party leaders, including Senator Ron Johnson, pleaded with Trump's most loyal supporters to embrace early absentee voting.
I like voting on election day because when I became a United States Senator, I had to vote absentee ballot. We need to embrace that, and today is the perfect example why. We can't afford to have a miserable election day on November and not have our votes already banked. So embrace early voting. We have to do that.
You guys are diehards. You're here.
Absolutely.
How does he win the state with those, that group of voters here in the state who go back and forth?
I liked hearing him say was we have to embrace the Democrat system. Vote early, vote early, vote early, vote early, and then vote early again. You have it's not as much, and this makes me sad as a conservative. This is not as much about winning ideas as collecting ballots. I hate that. That's just not a way to elect
Democrats
leaders.
rig it.
It's not. It's just about collecting ballots, and so we just have to collect more ballots.
What do you think about 2020?
Well, I really believe it was a rigged election. I believe that Trump got the majority of the votes, and I think that the Democrats rigged the election.
Republican Party of Wisconsin Chairman Brian Schimming.
I've had conversations with Laura Trump and with others at the RNC and people, on our side. And early vote is part of what we're doing. I've been the first state chairman in the country to adopt an early vote campaign, the Bank Your Vote campaign, and that's going to continue. We're going to have a huge emphasis on early vote. The Trump campaign will, and the state party will, and we're going to deliver on it.
Does it give you any heartburn that Trump continues to say things like the election was stolen or he won Wisconsin in 2020 when you know there's a segment of voters who want to move on from that, key voters that you need?
Yeah, doesn't give me a lot of heartburn. In fact, that's something I brought at the RNC, that Laura Trump is out talking to her family member and co-chair of the RNC is out talking about early vote now. So I think you will see a pretty consistent message there.
Mark Dickinson, who says he voted for Trump in 16 and 20, drove to Green Bay from Eau Claire.
What do you think he has to do to win Wisconsin?
I think what he needs to do is talk about positively what he has to offer, leave the past behind, and tell us this is what, he's proven before what he can do, and I think he needs to make that the main part of his campaign. This is what I did, this is what I can do. Donald Trump is a can-do man.
When you say the past, you mean 2020?
I mean 2020. Yeah.
Where's Eric? Eric, good job. Man, I tell you, I am giving you my complete and total endorsement. So go out and win.
Trump endorsed Republican U.S. Senate candidate Eric Hovde Tuesday night, who's attempting to unseat Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin. Hovde Thursday after an event in Milwaukee.
I'm curious about what you think when Trump continues to say things like the election was stolen or he won Wisconsin in 2020 when he didn't.
Look, I'm not here to litigate 2020. I'm running in 2024. I'm running for the U.S. Senate. But I do say we have to get confidence back in our election system.
Like always, let's bring in ABC News political director Rick Klein. Hey, Rick, good to see you.
You bet. Good to be with you.
All right, let's walk through some of these results. Let's start with Republicans. Does it even matter at this point when you look at Wisconsin's primary results and you see Nikki Haley getting 13%? Some more than 120,000 Republican voters did not vote for Trump on Tuesday.
Yeah, it doesn't matter, and it does simultaneously. The reason it doesn't is obviously he's going to be the nominee, and there's nothing that changes that out of Wisconsin. But what does matter is almost all of these votes, as you know, were cast after Nikki Haley dropped out of the race almost a month ago. So if you're still voting Republican in a Republican primary and going there to vote for Nikki Haley or just anyone other than Donald Trump, you're making a statement. And it's a loud statement that we've seen across a range of states through the early primary process.
I know this is the million-dollar question, but do we have any idea what these voters are going to do in November?
Yeah, we don't. I mean, look, the exit polling in other states, and there wasn't any exit polling in Wisconsin this week, unfortunately, but in the other states it suggested that there was a chunk of them who were unlikely to vote for Donald Trump at all, that we're saying at least now that they would rather stay home or vote for Joe Biden. Maybe they'll flirt with Robert Kennedy Jr. or another third-party candidate. Some number of them, I presume, are going to come home to the Republican Party. Some of them never were Republicans in the first place.
All right, let's talk Democrats. Yes, Biden received 89% of the vote, but some 48,000 voted uninstructed. How big of a deal is this?
Yeah, once again, that's more than enough to make up a difference in a state like Wisconsin most years, including the last in the last cycle. And similar story from the other side. Many of them will ultimately vote for Joe Biden or the Democrat because they're Democratic voters, but some of them won't. Some of them may stay home. Some of them could vote third party. It is so striking to me see how early this whole primary process was wrapped up, and yet how frustrated voters seem to be with the choices that they're stuck with.
ABC News political director Rick Klein. Rick, like always, thank you.
Hey, you bet. Thank you.
Up next, the Lincoln Project in Wisconsin, the group's efforts to prevent former President Donald Trump from being reelected. A Wisconsin native, a former Republican strategist, here next.